Hey everyone, welcome to another APES lecture. We're going to finish off the biogeochemical cycles we haven't gone over yet today in regards to nitrogen, phosphorus, and the sulfur cycle. Before we move on though, I want to point out just a reminder that on the class website you can find kind of this little cheat sheet under ecosystem ecology. Just kind of what you really need to know, the important aspects of each cycle, how humans alter it, a quick summary, and so on. So a good thing to add to your notes, including that the book you made as well. So let's get started. We're going to look at the nitrogen cycle first. So there's many different transformations. Out of all the biogeochemical cycles, this one is going to have the most kind of change of the element nitrogen, or it's going to be in a lot of different forms. Before we start though, it is considered a macronutrient, so think macro, large. So organisms need this in large amounts to survive. For example, they're the building blocks of proteins. They're in our DNA and our RNA. So all organisms are going to need this nitrogen in a large form. Unfortunately, it's a limiting nutrient. What all that means is without this nutrient, an organism is limited, especially in its growth. And we especially see this in producers. When there's a lack of nitrogen, maybe you have a house plant that's starting to get yellow leaves, that is usually a sign that there's not enough nitrogen in the soil. So a limited nutrient means it's not available in large quantities, but it is required for growth. So mentioning that there's a bunch of different cycles, we're first going to look at the nitrogen fixation. And before we start that, it's important to note that the largest pool of nitrogen is in our atmosphere. But unfortunately, that gas form cannot be used by producers, so what they have to do is what we call nitrogen fixation. And all that's happening is it's converting nitrogen into a usable form, and in this case, it's going to be ammonia. So that ammonia, once it's converted, the nitrogen's converted to NH4, it can then be brought up through the plant's roots. And this is a biotic fixation. There's two ways, there's biotic and there's abiotic, but what the bacteria will do, like I mentioned, it'll form that cyanobacteria, it'll excrete this ammonia, and as a result, the ammonia goes up the roots of the plants. But it's also a symbiotic relationship because the plant is providing sugars for that cyanobacteria. Another example of cyanobacteria is just your blue-green algae. And this is done through legumes as well. These are your bean plants or pea plants. You might see nodules on the roots of those plants. Those nodules are where the nitrogen fixation takes place. Nitrogen fixation can also take place abiotically through combustion of forest fires and even lightning, and that converts that nitrogen gas into nitrate, a more usable form. So going back, remember that this is a limiting factor. There's not a lot of it available. So what humans have done, we have essentially fixed more nitrogen than what nature fixes on its own in the goal of increasing crop yields. So almost every fertilizer you'll buy has nitrogen in it, especially they'll use it for corn crops. Corn needs lots of nitrogen to grow. To grow. In nitrification, we have this ammonia that's not taken up by the plants. It takes a little bit, but if we notice at the bottom of this diagram, there's a little bit left over. The ammonia that's not taken up by the plants is converted into that bacteria again, into a nitrate, which is taken up by the roots as well. So whatever ammonia is not taken up, it's converted by that bacteria again into nitrate, another usable form. Assimilation. So think to assimilate, you blend in. So nitrogen is assimilated through the food web or food chains. In this diagram, we see the rabbit eating the vegetation. So the nitrogen is assimilating into the consumer's body through consumption or eating. And that's how humans incorporate as well. So with mineralization, what's going on is we have this what's called ammonification. And all that's happening is that detritus is just being converted into that ammonia again. That's being created by that the bacteria that's doing the decomposing, and it's creating this solid compound. And it's going back into an inorganic compound that's not alive. So the denitrification sequence, what's happening here is in the bottom mostly of lakes, swamps, ponds, where there's lots of mud and not a lot of oxygen. There's limited oxygen. So what's happening here is ammonia is being converted into nitrate ions, and eventually it's going to be replaced back into the atmosphere into that N2 gas. Humans, again, we're looking at each cycle, how they are affecting each individual cycle. So humans, what we do is nitrate leaching. The farmer is going to fertilize his crops. The crops aren't going to use all that nitrogen or all that fertilizer, and what will happen is leaching means it's going to just travel through the soil into groundwater reserves. And once it's in the groundwater reserves, it's in our water supply. It can also be put into the increase into the atmosphere just by spraying it. So as it's sprayed on the farm fields, it travels back into the atmosphere, increasing the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere. And then the fertilizers. What happens is on these fields, you'll get species that aren't really adapted to survive in high nitrogen environments. So what we see around farms where they use a lot of nitrogen is it reduces the amount of species up to 48% in certain areas. And what that also allows for is colonization of new species that can survive in high nitrogen environments. So those natural native species that can't withstand high amounts of nitrogen are booted out. Moving on to the phosphorus cycle, you're going to see it's another form of fertilizer used by humans. But we use it, it's in our RNA and DNA. It's the P and ATP adenosine triphosphate, so it's used for energy. And just like nitrogen, it's a limiting nutrient as well. So it's needed in high amounts, but it's not found in nature quite often. It will travel between water and land. It's not in the atmosphere. So there is no gas phase, and it doesn't change form. It stays in that solid phosphate form, just going from the marine or water environment into the geology or the surface of the earth. So looking at assimilation, what we're looking at is once waste products are decomposed by fungi and bacteria, they'll be assimilated into the rock layers, and that process we call mineralization. Just kind of what happened with nitrogen. Same thing is happening is as these animals or living organisms decompose, they become part of the rock cycle. Eventually, it will build up in sediment. So we can have sediment building up in the through weathering and erosion. So weathering is just the work of water and wind breaking down the rock. It'll settle in the ocean and it'll drift to the bottom. What will eventually happen, though, is we'll have geologic uplift or mountain building, exposing that phosphate rock that was once under the water, now onto the surface. And again, it goes through the process of weather and erosion, goes back into the water, and the process continues. Humans are impacting the phosphorus cycle. One, we mine it quite a bit. So we're altering the land to mine this phosphate. And what we're doing it for is, again, that fertilizer. And as we learned in the nitrogen cycle, it will leach, it will get into the water supply, and as an effect, we get these algal blooms. So just imagine this is a bunch of nutrients going into a water system. The aquatic plants use that, and so that bloom is just the algae reacting to the fertilizer or the phosphate. This is a negative occurrence because what happens in waterways, in this case the Mississippi watershed, you have all the water from farms and cities ending up in the same body of water, and we have our algal blooms. And what will happen is a hypoxia, because eventually that algae will die. And when it dies, it sinks to the bottom. And as it decomposes, water in the ocean or lake, the amount of oxygen in that water will decrease, limiting the amount of fish and aquatic animals that can live there. This happens usually late in the year in Midwestern towns. This is an example of Cleveland, where the lake is emptying, or the river is emptying into Lake Erie. So you have to imagine all season long, farmers have putting on their crops fertilizers, and it's being washed down the river. So to give you an idea, here's Lake Erie, there's Toledo, Detroit would be up here, and we can actually see it traveling from the river into the lake. So there's all the algal bloom. Again, it's going to limit the amount of oxygen. So you're going to have hypoxia in this whole area, limiting the amount of oxygen available for marine organisms. Our last few cycles are calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sulfur. Important, just the same, but we're going to go over them really quick. Most of these are the top three: calcium, magnesium, potassium will regulate our cell processes, and we get them mostly from rock or decomposed vegetation. And they stay mostly, will be dissolved in water, but most of them stay within the soil. The one thing to point out, though, is potassium has a very difficult time staying attached to soil due to its weak attraction. So usually after solid rains, we'll see a lot of leaching of potassium from a field. Moving on to this sulfur cycle, a macronutrient, so needed in large supplies. Okay, we mostly see it in rocks, especially volcanic rocks, due to the volcanic emissions, and over time through weathering and erosion, it will be removed from those areas. It is cycled through the food web. As we eat plants who have absorbed it through their roots, it becomes assimilated into us. And as we mentioned before, the volcanoes are releasing it, but humans are as well through their burning of fossil fuels. And this results in what we call acid rain. So that sulfuric acid that will go up into the atmosphere, condense with the clouds, and fall down in a different area as precipitation, causing, again, that acid rain. So those are all the final biogeochemical cycle components. As always, refer to that cheat sheet found on the website, or if you have any questions, you can always email or come see me.